People like pirates, people like space marines, and so one of my patrons, Kukasaurus, thought it'd be a good idea to combine the two and create a pirate-themed Chaos Space Marine warband called the Black Hands. In this video, I'll be kitbashing the supporter-submitted custom marine, and if you'd like to be in for a chance to have your own custom marines made into a mini and sent to you, then stick around until the end. Now, these aren't your regular Red Corsairs. These are former sea wolves who encountered something deep beneath the waves that corrupted them. So, to represent the fact that these are more recent corruptions, I opted to base the build on a Primaris Marine, specifically an Assault Intercessor. Now, technically, Primaris are supposed to be a little more incorruptible, but that's clearly just propaganda from Big Call. After clipping away the parts and cleaning them of any mold lines, I then proceeded to remove the Imperialis from the chest. This was done with my knife and the bulk of the symbol being cut away before using a combination of my knife and a file to smooth out the armour. This gave the armour a more generic look that could be more easily customised to create a more chaotic appearance. To give this Chaos Warrior a traditional pirate look, I opted to swap out his pistol for more of a black powder inspired variant. The new pistol was based around a Free Guild Fusilier's Fusil cannon from the Cities of Sigmar range. To line it up with a regular Assault Intercessor bolt pistol, a considerable amount of clipping was required. This removed everything with the exception of the magazine, grip and rear of the pistol. Once these parts were removed, the remaining areas were cleaned up with a file. After comparing the Fusil cannon, I realised that this would also need to be clipped and trimmed down at the back. After the initial cut, further comparisons and trims were made until the two parts could be glued together. Finally, the arm was attached to the torso. To represent the aquatic corruption that the Black Hands were exposed to, I found this tentacled arm from the Chaos Possessed squad. While I'd settled on this particular arm, there are lots of alternatives to pick from, particularly the tentacles of the Nurgle range and claws from the Slaaneshi factions. To attach the arm to the Primaris torso, the top of the shoulder needed to be clipped down and flattened in order to fit against the flat part of the armour. Once I was happy with the fit, I glued the arm into place. From here, the shoulder pads and backpack were attached. Both of these were taken from the Chaos Marine kit. While I'd avoided the Chaos armour for the rest of the model, including a small amount of chaotic flair to the armour would go a long way to signify that these just weren't Primaris Marines. To really hammer this point home, it was time for some dead animal bits. This time around, they took the form of some impaled skulls. These were taken from the Soul Grinder kit, but you could also use the regular skulls from the Citadel Skulls kit instead. These were clipped down a little to allow them to fit more securely against the armour before being glued across the armour. As a nod to the Sea Wolf origins of this warband, a Space Wolf knife was attached to the belt, followed by a few components from the Akhelian kits found within the Idoneth Deepkin range. These just helped to infuse the model with a little more nautical feeling. To finish off some of the extra detailing, I decided to add a Cataphractii tilt shield to the left shoulder, just to help balance out the previously attached skulls. For the head, I settled on one of the heads from the Horus Heresy character head set. It was specifically selected due to its slightly manic expression. This didn't need any further adjustments beyond the usual cleaning up, and was glued to the torso with superglue, following the line of the pistol arm. With the model complete, it just needed a suitable base. This would be created from some corrugated plasticard. After roughly cutting out a piece that was around the size of a 32mm base, I then continued to clip away and break up that edge. My goal was to create a corroded and dilapidated metal platform, and this effect was further enhanced by drilling various size holes through the panel to create the effect of corrosion eating away at the metal. To raise up the platform, two sections of plasticard I-beams were cut, corroded and laid parallel to each other across the base. The plate was attached to these along with a few smaller chunks of paneling. Finally, the marine was glued and everything was ready to be painted. But before I break out the paints, if you are enjoying this video so far, then please do leave me a like, and as only about half of you currently watching are subscribed, I'd be extremely grateful if you would consider hitting the subscribe button too. That way you don't miss out on future videos like this. I began the painting with a primer. For this, I opted to use some of Colourforge's Matte Black. This is a rattle can primer, and now that the weather is starting to get a little warmer here in the UK, I find myself using this more than my airbrush for priming. I've used quite a few primers over the years, and this is probably my favourite. It covers nicely, and even though it's still a little chilly, I don't find myself having any problems with it. As the main colour scheme of the model was going to be red, I began with some Berserker Red from the Two Thin Coats range. To save time, I added it to my airbrush along with a few drops of Airbrush Thinner. I sprayed from below the model as I wanted these deep red areas to remain visible within those recesses. I focused the application of this paint to the upper sides of the model, with a few small spots being focused onto a few areas like tops of the feet, the knee pads, and any of the points that faced upwards, leaving the black primer and shading in the recesses. While some shading had already been achieved, this was pushed further by spraying a little of the brighter Sanguine Scarlet. I used this to cover the smaller area than before, focusing predominantly onto those upper areas and edges. Next up were the edge details. Here I used some Demon Red from the Two Thin Coats range. This paint was carefully applied to just the hard edges of the armour to create a thin line of paint which raised up these details from the darker panels of armour. In addition to the edges, some small flecks were added across the armour to create the appearance of light damage and scratches. This is optional, but it does help to add an extra level of detail. To push those scratches further, some Craven Yellow was mixed into my Demon Red and applied as smaller scratches on top of the previous ones. This just served to bring out that surface damage even further. From here, a process of base coat, highlight and extreme highlight was followed for each step. This began with Death Reaper, and this paint was used to block out all the pipe areas between the armor panels and the right hand, creating the black hand of the Black Hands. The edges of these areas were then lined with a little Cold Corpse Blue, followed by some small spots of Wolf Grey to finish off. To take on the leather pouches, knife sheath and belt, I began with some Scorched Earth, highlighted with Ancient Forest, and then finally Wasteland Brown. For the skin of both the head and the mutated arm, some Argonaut Skin was applied. Over a black base coat, this required a few layers to get a good coverage, but I thinned out the paint with some water and allowed the layers to dry fully before applying more paint. The flesh was then highlighted as per usual using Kronos Flesh first, and then some Ares Flesh. Finally, a few small spots of Vampire Fang were used to pick out the sharpest details. This is quite a lot lighter than the previous paint, so it really adds a degree of sharpness to these points. I then gave the skulls, spines and other bone details an initial base coat of Skeleton Legion, followed by Dragon Fang, and some small spots of Ivory Tusk for an extreme highlight. The final base coat was for the metallics, and for this I chose some Surcoat Silver. This was used to paint the pistol, knife and a few of the pipes and vents on the backpack. With all the base coats in place, the remaining steps would focus on applying some extra details in the form of decals and weathering. But before these could be applied, I needed to apply a layer of gloss varnish. This time I used my airbrush, but Colourforge also make an excellent gloss varnish that I could have used instead. While the gloss varnish dried, I used my knife to cut away a few decals from the Chaos Space Marine sheet. These included various symbols and text. Once removed, they were added to a shallow dish of water and given a chance to separate from the backing paper. Once things had loosened up a little, I held the paper close to the target location and used a damp brush to gently tease the transfer into position. Once they were in place, they were allowed to fully dry before proceeding. When applying decals, they quite often bubble up or have a slight halo effect around them because they don't properly follow the curved contours such as these pauldrons. To remedy this, I use some Microsol, which is a decal softener. It's a mild solvent that, when brushed onto a decal, will slightly soften it, allowing it to better conform to the surface it sits upon. I applied my first layer and let it to fully dry before applying a second. Some decals take longer to soften and require more layers, but I'd recommend only applying small amounts at a time and giving it ample time to dry between applications. You'll know when you're done when the decal starts to look more like it's been painted on to the surface. To seal in the decal and prevent it from being lifted up by subsequent layers, a second coat of gloss varnish was applied on top. For the weathering, I made extensive use of a product called Newsh. This is an acrylic medium that allows you to use your regular acrylic paints in a similar way to how oil paints or washable paints work, in the sense that you're able to adjust them and blend them after you've applied the paint. I mixed in some Jade from Monument Hobbies. I chose this because Pro Acryl range has a very strong pigmentation, so even after I've diluted it somewhat, I'm still left with a strong colour. It works a little like a slow drying medium, so when you mix it up with your paint, in this case I'm using 1 drop of paint to around 3 drops of Newsh plus a little water. I applied this mix across the mutated arm. The little bit of water caused the paint to flow more into those recesses. Then, using an old glasses cleaning cloth dipped in water, I carefully removed the paint from the raised details, leaving the skin tone beneath. This created a nice gradient from the bright bluish green in the recesses to the skin tone, helping to push that mutated effect even further. This same process was then repeated, this time using the bright Jade, and applied it in streaks across the armour. From here, a damp brush was then dragged down over the streaks. This caused the paint to be dragged along with it, giving the impression of corrosion and verdigris forming and running down the armour. The blues of this and the arm contrasted strongly against the armour colour and helped to separate this warband from other red armoured Chaos Marines. Further weathering was applied to the metallics, this time using dark umber with Newsh, followed by a few spots of burnt orange to create those fresher, brighter spots of rust. To finish things off, a little Oblivion black wash was painted into the recesses. The previous steps had lightened some of these spots up a little too much, which softened the details somewhat. This black wash would help to bring back that contrasting shadow. With the model complete, I could once again turn my attention to the base. The metal of the platform was given a rusty effect, in much the same way that the pistol was tackled. It was first given a layer of dark umber and Newsh, followed by a few small spots of burnt orange, before bringing back a few areas of clean metal with a very rough edge highlight of Surcoat silver. I then painted the base below the platform to appear like water using a thin layer of Jade. The glossiness of the earlier varnishes was a little distracting from the details though, so I gave everything a spray of matte varnish to help tone this down and seal in those weathering layers. The final step involved another product, AK Still Water. This is a viscous liquid that, when applied in thin layers, can be used to build up the effect of water. Coupled with the previous layer of paint, it gave the impression of deep, murky water, perfect for the origins of the Black Hands. And with that, the model was complete. And so, that concludes this build of a member of the Black Hands Warband, as submitted by one of my patrons, Kukasaurus, and this model will be making its way to them very shortly. If you have an idea for a custom Space Marine chapter or warband that you'd like to see me tackle in one of these videos, and you are one of my channel members or Patreon supporters, then keep an eye out for a link on either my community tab or Patreon page. There, you'll be able to submit your ideas to be featured in the next custom Marine video. If you are not already a supporter, you can either use the join button below or follow the links down in the description. In addition to your submission, you'll also get access to sneak peeks, early and ad-free videos, plus some exclusive merchandise, and you'll help to keep this channel going at the same time. You can find all the parts and paints that I used in this build below in the description, along with a few affiliate links. Before I go, I just want to thank all of my lovely current supporters, especially my Pouch of Dead Animal Bits tier and above supporters, who are Andrew Console, Axel Jonsson, Bartosz Sokovic, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Ian, Immaterial Creations, Zazuya, Maciej Savitsky, Matt Brower, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Plobs of Corn, Ryan Little, Swedsman, and Tim. And my Sergeant level channel members, who are Lloyd Davies, Dea, Trooper Geo, Mr. Jared Hess 95, David, John Gibbs, The Sire Acquired, Philip Poyer, Nonington Paints, Mark Taylor, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.